Hello, I'm Penelope Maver, and welcome to Earth Converse podcast, an exploration into our relationships and conversations with the Earth, all in the hope of inspiring a deeper connection with ourselves, each other, and the Earth that is our home. And I'm very honoured today to talk to Petra Lentz-Snow. She is the Executive Director from the School of Lost Borders. And this is the school I mentioned in episode 1 and 2, founded by Steve Foster and Meredith Little. And they help people to undertake vision fasts and rites of passage, the ancient human practices of going out to nature to seek connection, wisdom, healing, and belonging. And in episode 4, I interviewed my guide, teacher, and Petra's colleague, Emerald North. And as guides, they help prepare people to go out solo in nature and help them make sense of their journey when they return. And I've done some training, co-guided, and was to be with them next month. And Petra and I have never met, but I tell you what, if she ever writes to you, your heart will sing. She is a writer and a poet, beautiful with her words. And indeed, I will include her blog in the episode description. Her blog, Journeys into Healing, explores her own journey with breast cancer as a rite of passage. So here she is, calling from the desert of California. She's outside, so you might hear some action. And she's willing to free flow, so listen in as she shares her experiences and perspectives on the conversations and relationships with the earth. And I must admit, I'm a little nervous.
To be here, Penelope. Good morning.
Yeah, well, good morning. So I just, it's the big sort of question, but what is your relationship with Mother Earth and how has it evolved?
Yeah. Well, first off, I wanted to say thank you for having me here for this conversation. I thought about this morning where to have the conversation, and I really did not want to be in my office, which I am spending too much time in these days as it is. And so I felt like if we're going to have a conversation about the natural world and the movement of the natural world, I better be as close to it as I can be. So I've walked out just a little ways, and I'm very lucky to live in a place where within 10 minutes I can be looking out at the the southernmost glacier of the northernmost hemisphere of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Mm-hmm. And on our other side is the beautiful mountain range of the Inyos, which from where I'm sitting on a old fallen tree, I can also see the peak of the Inyos, which I can almost see the place, at least the general direction of the place where you would have been in base camp, Penelope, in just a couple of weeks when you would have come to the California month-long training, which we had to cancel due to the pandemic. So that's where I am, and I think that's just a way to say, where we come from, where we speak from, and it's a place here that the Paiute people called Kaya Hunaru, the land of flowing water. And it used to be an orchard. This entire valley used to be an orchard before the water was diverted to Los Angeles. So I think my personal relationship with nature has changed so much over time. And that's, when you mentioned this question before we met, that's where you wanted to start. And it really had me thinking about my relationship with nature from the beginning to where it is now. And it's incredibly how in the 55 years that I've been on this planet, in this particular body, how much my relationship has shifted. And the heart of the work that has been my life work is actually the claim that we as humans are not separate from nature, that human nature is not separate from nature, and that all is nature. There is no non-nature. Nature is everything. And that was certainly not my experience in my growing up. In fact, in my growing up, I grew up as a little girl in northern Germany who would open her refrigerator and get milk out of a bottle and pour it over cereal that was coming from a box. I didn't have any understanding of the relationship between food and the land. And so I, like many, many, many millions of us that are so-called civilized, have really lost a tactile sense of nature from beginning to start. So food is only really one venue of that, but it's a big venue. Movement is another one, because we are moving in, machinery. We are so insulated from nature that it's hard for us to have the sense of the rawness of nature, the experience of it, be anything that we are in close relationship with. And I think while everything is nature, that's the other thing, none of the metal on the plane is not also nature. There is nothing that isn't nature. That's how I walk in the world. And yet the more modified the form is, the less the sense of the energy field and connection is available. It's almost like you're at the end of a very, very, very long line that reaches all the way back to the mother root. And so I think I was always, like most children, naturally drawn to go to the mother root, to be outside as much as possible, to get barefoot when it was warm, to be running around and eating wild hazelnuts when we could find them, or whatever it was, in our play, in our world. That was where I felt, most belonging. And I think this is true I have heard so many people in circle. I have listened to so many stories. I hear this over and over and over again. Nature was my sanctuary. Nature was this. Nature was this to me. Nature was the only place. Whether children have been through grueling abuse or whatever, they go to nature. They naturally go to the rawest form of life, which we are always part of. So again, I use life the way I use nature. It's what we are, what we are part of, what we belong to. And they flee. I've heard stories of children that were hiding out under trees when the alcoholic father was raging through the house. There's an innate way in which we take refuge in nature, in which we know we need it. It's as innate and as instinctual as opening up the window to let some fresh air in, or just needing to see the sky. That's instinctual. That's really deep in us. And I think no matter how much we are separated and have been separated, those seeds in us are still in there. That remembering that human nature is not separate from nature is part of us. You cannot beat it out of anyone. And even though it has been beat out of us in many, many ways, it is like a seed, and all it needs is get water. And so no matter how removed we have been, the exposure to raw nature has that potential to water that seed. And I love to understand more and follow the thread of seeds, because they are the most intricate miracle of nature. If we look at all these great inventions and things, but you look at this tiny little seed that has everything in it to make this amazing plant, to even make an entire tree that lives for hundreds of years. And some of these seeds, they can survive. They have actually found seeds in old under the ice, artifacts of medicine bags of people that would carry seeds around that were 30,000 years old, and they still sprouted. It's like, and so that to me is that same sense that I have with someone who was born in, like I was in Hamburg, Germany, in a completely, in a culture, in a big city, in war, through wars and, white culture and all the stuff. And yet, that seed, if it gets watered, everything can still blossom. And so that's kind of like the long arc, I think, from the level of separation that I experienced as a child and, the level of estrangement, to what is resounding in me today in a way that of belonging. And that seed of belonging is in all of us. And it's magical. And it wants to and needs to be remembered.
And from the seed to the sort of the belonging, the woman of rootedness, what were the points of, real spurging of growth, or, or the branches, or where was the pruning? Do you want to elaborate?
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. That's the story of my life. Yeah. Well, one part of it was very clear for me. This was before I knew anything about rites of passage. I was 19 years old. I finished high school. I didn't know what to do in the world because nothing made sense to me. Making money just didn't make sense to me. I felt like, in Germany, it was a good social system. I realized that I was already going to be in the top 10 percentile of people in the world population as far as wealth goes, and safety and security. And I thought, why I would want to make money was past me. I had no desire for material possessions. I was deeply craving belonging. I was deeply questioning purpose and who I was and what I was to do with my life. Like all those good questions that are really torturing us when we're young. And they sent us on the journey. And so my journey sent me to a friend who was a rich friend with a sailboat, who was a friend of my parents in the Mediterranean, who took me to Sardinia. And there I took it upon myself to camp and hitchhike down the coast and wanting to discover life there on my own. And for some serendipitous reason, I ended up in a valley that was very much, it was called the Valley of the Moon. It had washed out granite caves that were by the ocean, and there was a lot of mix of hippies and, mainly hippies, people running around naked, throwing acid, which I had no idea that they were even doing at the time. But I was fascinated by the life of living just by the sea and being, out there every day with my body. It was the first time I was in a place where there were absolutely no lights. And so I was really living this very surreal dream state life. And I stayed in that place for several weeks, sort of slowly rewilding, losing more and more of my clothes and being more and more comfortable with sometimes being naked. And it was a very interesting, very eclectic sort of people there that I met, lots of them runaways. And eventually somebody one morning stole all my money, which I had kept somewhere in one of the caves. And I thought we were all friends. And I had my little thing there. And so luckily they didn't take my passport. But I was all of a sudden without a dime to my name. And it was a really defining moment in my life. That day I gave everything away that I had. I had a backpack. I had lots of things that they didn't have there. And so I gave all of it away. I only had my sleeping bag and a belt to strap it together and hang it over my shoulder. And I began to live on the street with this other band of people. And we would, my first Italian sentence was, do you have some change? And so I lived on the street for 3 months, learning a lot But my really deep root of that journey was the understanding of how it really was for 3 months to live under the cycles of the moon, when I could actually walk the cliffs without falling, how on the new moon night I couldn't get to certain places, how we could fish out of the water and make food, how to go hungry, how to be in community of people in order to make it through in some way. And it was my first rite of passage without knowing what it was. It stripped me of the identity that I had before. And I had no idea what it was. But, again, most of what we do in the rites of passage is not facilitation. We witness the process. We, try to give it a container, a voice. We support it. We partner it. We are not the ones offering the initiation. That's life. Life is perpetually moving us into initiation and initiatory processes. So for me, that was my big one. And my big first one, and it's what put my feet on this path. Yeah. Since then, I went back to Italy every summer, even after I kind of went home, cleaned up for a while. Eventually, I spent every 3 months at the beach in Italy during those times while I was in university eventually, and became a naturopath eventually. So all those pathways of, the natural world that I was pursuing, and eventually found my way into the books of Sun Bear and the book of the Vision Fast and Stephen and Meredith. And by my 20s, I was in this very valley, very close to the place I'm standing in right now, doing training with them, and then starting to guide by the time I was, 28 years old. My first vision fast was actually in Spain, since you are reporting out of Spain right now, in the little island of Formentera, and it was in a cave. So my first vision fast was in the darkness of a cave for 3 days and 3 nights in total darkness. That was my beginning of this practice. Yeah.
It sounds like the real sense of being in you, like literally stripped bare, and then in this sort of emergence, and then just following, this literally the nature's path or naturopath, and into the guiding world. I guess there's so much richness in those stories. But in terms of your vision quest or your work with Sun Bear and with guiding, do you converse with the earth? What does that mean to you? What is that relationship that you have? This, you've got this real sense of belonging. It is your container for your but how would you describe it for you?
Well, I think one of the things of the actual conversation with nature that has really become more and more important to me. It too has really changed over time. I think I will start there, because if I track back, when I started fasting and being out in these ceremonies in my early 20s, there was a lot of an awkwardness about the how. So there was a lot of questions. Like, one of my first things I think that I noticed when I did vision fasting is how little I still belonged. So I was terrified of the nights by myself, terrified of whether it was mountain lion or whether it was going crazy or whether it was just some wrestling in the bushes. There was this sense of being out all alone, and the darkness would come, and I would not feel my belonging. I remember many fasts where my knife was like right next to my sleeping bag, blade slipped out, blade in the sand, so I could grab it right away. And there were many a time at night I would. There were many a time I had to die to my fears of not belonging and say, I can't go back. It's like I can't turn around and run away from this fear, because it's here with me and I the only way to be with it is to be here. And if this is going to cost me my life, then I will go for that. So that kind of staying power. And over time, it really took time for me to learn that I was actually really held. So every time I would come back from a threshold, safe and sound, I would feel incredibly empowered and loved, and realizing that even though I had no way to defend myself out there, and I went to some pretty far places, I would still be held. So that must somehow mean that the grandmothers, whoever, life itself actually wanted me to be there. That I wasn't just protecting myself enough to be safe, which is really what I was taught as a civilized person, right? I mean, it goes so deep in our culture of this colonial society that we come out of, where we are always in houses. And so we are always having these big walls around us. And when the wind, is harsh outside, we go inside. Yeah. We are always in this buffered way. And what is lacking in us is the feeling that actually we are our own movement, our own feeling, our own force also, and our own ability and capability. We're so padded. Our temperature is always kind of magically tempered. Mm-hmm. And pampered. We are really pampered. So part of it was exposing myself to the risk of not belonging. That the fears that came with not belonging, whether they're rational or not rational, it doesn't matter. It's all the same real, I think that's one of the things that we have to learn here. And I think the conversations that I used to have were very different. A lot of times, this is another big indicator, and I hear this in stories all the time. I think it's part of our humanness of being so estranged from nature, is the sense of not being able to find my place. I would walk around on all these mission fasts, and I would ask Spirit to find me, to find my place. I couldn't find a place. I have had fasts where I would return to base camp despaired, after like hours and hours and tell my teachers there was no place out there for me. And I crossed miles and miles of territory, I have had moments of exhausting myself to try to find a place, and finally breaking down somewhere with my gallon of water, and after a really good long cry, sitting there and looking around saying, this is not so bad. No, will you have me, place? Like, will you let me be here? And it was like, and the yes was coming, And there were lots and lots of times when I would ask a question into the wind or to a tree or to a rock, and I wouldn't quite get a clear answer. Or I would get a clear answer, and I wasn't really sure whether that was really the answer or whether I was just making up that answer, and all of everything was coming back at me. And what's really reflected was all the doubt. And I would say today, from being an almost crone now, I got into cronehood early, I think, through menopause early and through cancer. It just takes time. That's what I would love more of everything, to tell the youngins today that are struggling with the sense of not belonging, and whatever fear that is, and whatever non-communication that they have with nature, is that all those communications are part of finding their way there. And it's part of the way finding them. And it's part of that conversation. And by today, my seeds have been watered so much by my times out in the raw. I will call it just times out in the raw, because that's really where it is. It's where the original is, the unchanged. The less changed it is, the more easy it is for me to feel the mother root. And as a refugee of my civilized culture, I may need to do that for the rest of my life, is ways to find the mother root. And, maybe more so than other communities or other members of our community, and tribal people and people that have had that very closely held, they may not feel that need as much as I do. So today I would say, that's really important to me, is that even all the ways in which we don't belong actually bring us to belonging. It's more of a risking ourselves to actually be there and to trust that whatever is coming on our vision fast, whether it's the pain of belonging, not belonging, or the fears that are paralyzed us, if we are just able to be there with it, that's all we have to do, because it is the next medicine for us. It will move us forward. It can't but move us, into a fuller expression of ourselves. It is watering our seeds.
I'm wanting to ask collective.
Go ahead.
No, carry on. So, carry on, Petra. Sorry.
Say again. I'm sorry.
In terms of the collective, about in terms of where we are now in the current conversation, is COVID watering our seeds? Is it? What's the sense here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think certainly, there's so much to say about that, but I think certainly it is all part of, the one thing I will say is that nature doesn't waste anything. And so this is something I go to on my personal level, and I can't tell you what COVID is all about. I think that we are finding out. It's finding us out. We're not the ones that are guiding the ceremony, clearly. But we are part of it, and that's the thing. It's like, I think as humans, we are offered an invitation, that's how I see it, to understand that we are not in control of life. And I think that is evoking a lot of fear right now. The conversation has moved, within a couple of months from the general sort of more intellectual, for some of us more physical, but a lot of it more kind of like that mercy kind of, oh my God, humans are destroying the earth. This is terrible for the generations that are going to be down the road for us, which is more of a theoretical standstill, to a really deep gut level fear of, oh my God, this is happening and our people might perish. And then we go to, no, we're going to find a vaccine, we're going to kick this thing, we're going to do all these things, right? It's really reminding me in a lot of ways of the cracking open that happens when you're diagnosed with cancer. And I'm writing a piece about that right now. And you realize that your life is not forever. I think there's those of us who have realized, but they're a small minority, that we too will not last as a species, because everything is constantly evolving and moving. And so the only way for us to really absorb the grandness of that is by understanding that we are not just the separate beings that we think. We are not just the ones that are in this current body right now. I'm sorry. Ooh. Oh yeah. There's a dirt bike rider that is having a really good time. Bless you too. So yeah, I think the understanding that we are not in control, and maybe with the softening of that, also the understanding that we don't need to be in control. And it doesn't mean that we're not in relationship with. It doesn't mean that we're just going to let COVID wash over us, and just whatever happens. But it means to be in relationship, to understand that the way life works is being in a relationship with, instead of having power over. I think the more we are starting to understand how, there's these great studies now about the forests and how the trees are all acting in accord, and how, you look at everything, what we breathe out, they breathe in, what they breathe out, we breathe in. Just asking myself the question the other day, rather philosophical level question, that if there were no more humans, a lot of people say right now we wouldn't be missed. We have such a deep, dark sense about who we are. It's such shame as humans for where we are in our evolution, that we feel like the planet would be better off without us. And I really asked myself that question, and I thought, well, if I need the oxygen that the tree generates, does it also need the carbon that I exhale? Is that because there's nothing in nature that appears in vain? Everything that appears is in some way, shape, or form the next step. And so that's how I see it with the pandemic too. There's something here in the pandemic that it wouldn't be arising if it wasn't on some way, shape, or form needed. If it wasn't needed by the greater, which we do not know. It's like that's the piece of unknowns to us, which we forgot. We are all very much stuck in a relationship. Even when we think ourselves as stewards, I think sometimes we look at ourselves as apart from, and the unbeknownst to us, the great mystery, that is that part of, that red thread that we are part of. That's the thing that doesn't come or go, if you will. That's the essence that we are part of. And we've pushed that part away a lot. I mean, we have, as a species, a Western culturalized species, has really pushed death completely in the shadows. And part of me is wondering if part of what's happening right now is that periodically, death will come forward and take its place. And that was one of my first hits that I had actually about this time, is that death is sitting at the table again. We have mitigated it. We have so many treatments now. We have almost, we have people experimenting whether people even have to die or maybe could live forever. We've really been, we have a deep, deep fear of death. And a lot of our decisions have to do with that. And it's bereaving us of an experience. It's also because it's coming out of being bereft. And there's more to say there, but I'll leave it there for the moment.
Yeah, but I am sort of like in terms of, because part of the, I think for my own, rites of passage or understanding to sit with that death, in terms of the experience of death lodges or Meredith's Living and Dying program. But this is what do we do? What do we do to with our relationship with that? And I mean, your own story, you're a guide that's part of, talking about death, but it's actually, you're taking it to another level of your own journey, where you're facing it in the cancer rite of passage. And I know it's a bigger story to go and hopefully another podcast, but I know, what do we do with it? What can we do in terms of relationship with death and with COVID, and in the sense of ambiguity in this moment as I suppose it's a how-to and a sort of.
Yeah, I think, I want to go back one more time to, I think a lot of this has to do in the split, in splitting human nature from nature. That's really the conversation, I think, that it's at the root there. And I want to say that I've listened to a really wonderful man, and I wish I could remember his name and the name of his tribe, but I think he was from the Pomo tribe in Los Angeles, and what came Los Angeles basin from the region down there. He talked about in a slideshow, a great presentation at the Bishop Paiute Center. He talked about how people that came over to colonize this land came with the understanding that indigenous people were savage, and they came with the understanding that the natural world was a wilderness. And they're really questioning that word, because they're saying to us it was just life. It was our world. It wasn't. It wasn't a wilderness. And so the wilderness is associated with being wild. It's associated with being savage. And he was basically saying to us that really indicates how separated you really all were, at that time. And it really got me into thinking, because at the root, the wound is the wound of not belonging. And it made me think about how all this non-belonging has really come from a long ways away and a long ways down. So if in the absence of belonging, we will try to conquer. As a human species, I think, the absence of belonging leads to the need to conquer. And it's really a coping mechanism that's caused by the suffering of displacement and separation. And I think that's what had this run in our history. So in some ways, as white people, I'm sad to say it's a generalization, but I feel sometimes we are professional homeless people. We are flitting about, and we have invaded and colonized and enslaved other cultures for a really long time. And again, no villa, right? No millions, no riches will ever really replace the sense of belonging. And so then all you can do is more and more and more and more. And you need more and more and more insulation too, because you're not belonging. And when you're not belonging, you're afraid. When you're not belonging, you can't trust. You cannot connect. And so what I want to say is that I wrestle with my own past and my own lineage. And I've come to understand that a lot of the people that immigrated in this country and that conquered early on, before immigration, that conquered this country really were desperados that came out of their own suffering. So it's, I think there really isn't any greater suffering than that of living in an exile from our belonging. And only that kind of suffering, that core kind of destructive wound, is actually powerful enough to create the kind of unbelievable violence that colonization and slavery have wrought. That's my understanding, and I'm still questioning whether that's an easy way out, but I really don't mean it as an excuse. It's just a sense in me that it's not possible that so much suffering could be possibly induced without the level of separation and suffering and terror that goes along with having to, committing these kind of acts. And I think we see that in an individual level of people committing violent crimes against their family. That a lot of times it's just the amount of damage that they have suffered themselves that they weren't able to transform or haven't had the resources to help them in any way, shape, or form to process.
And it's interesting.
So
It's making me think about actually self-abuse. If we're part of nature, there's something about that, isn't there? Like, we're harming ourselves. That's kind of
So there's a sense that like humans are really in a way acting as like wounded and deranged animals. We've had a really wonderful friend who of the school who eventually we inherited our great bubble top gear truck from. His name was Durham, and he used to say to Stephen and Meredith that the study of humans is like the study of a caged animal.
Oh, yeah.
It's like we're not studying the inherent nature of humans right now. Most of the time we're studying the human nature that's been encaged. It's like we're not studying humans in the wild because we've basically we've done our best to eradicate them. And so to understand the grief of what that means, and as white folks, these are our ancestors. For me personally, my grandfather was in Hitler's SS, and it's something that I have struggled with and hurt with so much my whole life. And but the understanding is that we carry both. We carry that burden of our history, and then we also carry those seeds from 30,000 years ago or longer. And and no matter how far down the line, the grandmothers have blown those seeds inside us. And we are the living flow of them. Still, every single one of us. But it's about finding that way back. And I want to bring death back in because I think that death is a really important place in the non-belonging chapter, because when we don't belong, we are terrified of death. And so, I've sat through so many times with Meredith in the practice of living and dying, because after my journey with cancer, I assisted and sat in as witness and participated in different levels of things with all of Meredith's and some of Scott's PLD courses, practice of living and dying courses. And, as a guide, once I was personally cracked open by death, my entire conversation shifted. And it's a shift that can only happen when we are exposed to death, in some way, shape, or form, when we are exposed to an edge that we realize that our life is not permanent and that we may not be here tomorrow. And it's a physical sense. It's something that's irrevocably shifts a perspective. It's something that we have actually taken out of life now for a long, long time. And in our Vision Fast ceremony, we try to emulate that to some degree, right? We try to put people in a stance that is as close to death as possible while keeping them safe. That's kind of like the blueprint of Vision Fast, rites of passage. And that's because the old ones knew that the knowing of death is vital. And that's also why, the people that became medicine people, that's often the ones that got sick, that almost died, or they came back from death, because they had an even deeper knowledge of that, right? And so we've done the opposite in our culture now. And we really are excluding death. And I've sat through a lot of circles with Meredith explaining what she felt is like the beginning of meaningless deaths that happened through the world wars, where there was a number of deaths, such a big number of deaths, that we couldn't process anymore. There was no room for ritual or relationship with death. And because of that, we kind of, shut off our relationship. And that certainly seems to be one good explanation of our lacking, relationship, our separation, our severance from death. But the one that has come up for me personally in my own inner being lately is that same absence of belonging is really actually part of it. Because without belonging, we are terrified of death. Because you can't really transition out of this life without belonging. And I think our psyche knows that. It's almost like, this beautiful poem, I can't remember now. My memory, his name's not so good. The poet who says, to be here just this once, to have been here just this once, Was
it Mary Oliver?
No, I don't know who it is, but it's something about how that changes everything, and that's really what I felt after through my journey with cancer and continue to feel today. It's like, it's not about how long we're going to be here. It's about having been here once, really being present. And if you look at the fear of death, it's all about prolonging, giving more time, because we really haven't arrived yet, right? So we try to push it out because we can't bear dying. I had a dream once, and this was actually before I got cancer, when I was in a really, really hard life situation, one of my hardest yet. And I had a dream about a man that was dying, and it was me. And this man was in the church, and somehow he was dying, and I understood in the dream that I, as this man, I can't remember, he was holding on to life. And I realized that he was so afraid of death, but he was suffering so badly. But death would not come before he would say yes to it. And I understood that death didn't come to us before we're ready. It can't take us before we're ready. And so, but not being ready hurt more than any death ever would. And I woke up with this, it really rocked me. And that's that same sense that I'm speaking to here, that I think our relationship with death, our fear, our terror, our separation has to do with the fact that we are so separate and that we don't belong. And so at that point, we're putting death outside, ourselves. We have to survive. Everything else can die. I can use everything else because I can't go away, because I'm actually not really even here. And instead of me being here, I'm going to just take up as much room as I can and be here as long as possible. So it's really a desperate mechanism. So we build more and more walls. We try to date later, and we try to deny. We're kind of like trying to think about what that would really mean. Becoming eternal. What the hell that would be? Can you imagine? But we live in a culture where dying is like the thought of being dead. We put people in caskets that prevent creepy crawlers to come and feed on them for 200 years. I mean, how sick is that? And how, that was one of my big childhood fears, actually, was being under the ground in a casket. I was very terrified of death as a child. And I kept asking about it. And nobody ever told me. I had to retell myself the story of death. That death is coming home. Nobody ever told me that. And we do it with everything in our land. We throw pesticides on the land and growth whatevers instead of really composting, instead of really feeding the ground that feeds us. We don't go cyclical. We constantly go linear. And so this is an invitation. The invitation is always to come back to the fact that the cyclical nature of life is holding us, and nature has our back. And it has our humans back too, not just all the other species. And yeah, we're really fucking up in a lot of ways. But probably also we are doing the best we possibly can with what we have, just like nature always does. And if you really look back, really, really long, all the way from when the first oxygen bubbles appeared, all the kind of death and destruction that happened on this planet and probably anywhere in the universe. And the pattern that I can see that really holds me up is that terrible things happened. But every time nature has a chance, it will turn into beauty. Every time nature has a chance, it will turn into beauty. And so I think right now in this time, we see people that have had their seeds watered, whether it was for their own merit or whether they had better resources or whether they had a better lineage, or I don't know how. They were in some way gifted. And I really don't want to use the word privileged anymore. They were gifted. Because nothing is owed. They were gifted in some way, shape, or form to have their seeds watered. And if we have, then we naturally want to seed what we want to water. We want to pass that watering on. That's what every good plant does. It will grow, and then it will make more seeds, and it'll throw out and thrust out those seeds into the world. And so if your seed is watered at this time, then I would say, go and help water someone else's seed. Go help activate another seed. Go help throw out more seeds. I think that's the calling of our time. And it doesn't deny the hardship. It doesn't deny there are no easy answers right now for us. There is so much suffering. There are I want to call them my sisters. I've never seen them, but I just saw them on TV, and clearly they must be my sisters. They're sitting on the street in Bangladesh in front of their factory, of their clothing factory, because they can't work, and they're screaming at their employer with their masks on that they need to work because their children are going hungry. It's like my friends in South Africa lived just across from a slum, and they started feeding 200 people at the beginning of this crisis, and now they're feeding 6,000 people every day. And all the people that have so little buffer. And it's wonderful that we don't buy clothes anymore right now, and that we don't consume, and that we don't drive around in our big gasoline vehicles. But there are people on the other side of that line that are really vulnerable, and they don't have the kind of storage spaces and stores of energy and money and food that we have. And there are no easy answers. Does that mean we should just, keep buying again and go back to Macy's? There are no easy answers. This is a rough time.
Yeah. And I guess what's to sit with that, isn't it? Because
I think part of it is really to sit with it. I think, again, for me, I can go to a place of shame and guilt so easily because of my lineage, and it typically doesn't actually really help me very much. But when I go there, I try to go there in a way and just get it out of my system, and then just kind of like looking back at what is it that's in my vicinity right now. And I'm not feeding people in the line, but I am offering extra support for lots of people right now, doing very exhausting Zoom consults and trying to put, the little drips of water that I can sprinkle them around, and to know that, it is not all up to us, and we are also not powerless. We are in relationship with.
Yeah, that's sort of the paradox, isn't it? It's holding both power. We're powerful and powerless at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a very human-centric perspective to think that it would depend all on us.
Yeah.
I really had this musing when somehow this picture came in to me of, just like the earth being just like a wild, shaggy dog, just like shaking herself just once, and all those fleas just flying off, and it just kind of felt like, here we are, thinking about how the precious Mother Earth, we're perturbing her, and all of a sudden we feel like, oh God, we might just get eradicated if, in this whole thing. It's like, that's amazing me. I mean, there's power there. And then the other thing that intrigues me is, while it doesn't depend all on us, it's also having us rather than us having it, but what's intriguing to me is what it evokes in us. And I think in the absence of being able to be with one another, one of the things that's coming out really clearly to me is that how important touch is to humans. How important it is for us to be touched. And so it's maybe part of this big threshold that we're all in, is part of that right now, to learn how to be touched again, to learn how to touch. And to learn, there's still lots of things that are open for business. Trees really, really still receive hugs very well.
Yes.
There is, right? There is wind that caresses our faces. And maybe there is a different kind of fasting that is required with the ceremony this time. Maybe it's not about foregoing food. Maybe it's about foregoing that ability of physical contact, and that the craving of that. What is it fostering in us? What is it birthing in us? Where is it pointing us? In the abstinence of things, they often grow stronger. I know that when I lost my hair to cancer, it was hard for me. And I know it's such a petty thing to say because it really doesn't matter. But man, when you're at it in that moment, it freaking matters. And I had shaved my head when I was in the cave when I was 19. I'd been there. I'd done that, I had long flowing hair, and I very much had it help me remember my feminine, which is really important to me because I was raised in a culture that's brutally masculine. And it's another part of my healing journey. I did not want to lose my hair. But when I did, I started dressing more feminine. I started wearing skirts and earrings, and it's something that has brought out the feminine ever more strongly in me, was having that taken away from me. And so that's the contemplation right now I think I'm sitting with in this time, is wondering, so, if not touching, is not here, what does it, how is all the ways in which I want to touch and nourish the world, and how does it come out in me when I can't go that usual route? Because one thing I know, it doesn't go away. It may go underground. It may come out differently. It may seep through your pores rather than pour through your whatever, but it can't go away. Nothing ever does. It just keeps changing.
I love that. I think in terms of the listeners having that reflection of seeing that, just what the noticing of that, and and also I love this contemplation of touch. That's really lovely. Because I guess here when we've been locked down, I've been sort of thinking, well, how can I feel the wind? How can I feel the sea? How can I, rain? And yes, and coming back to our bodies and coming back to that realness. And I suppose I'm linking back to you going to Sardinia and being a wild child there. In terms of, I suppose, the seeds, just closing up, the seeds of, is there anything you want to share about the seeds of whether this, the School of Lost Borders or you work with women or life initiations? Anything you want to share before we close up?
Well, I kind of where you just went actually it has more juice for me right now. So I would love to close with that if I may. And that is really your question of how do I, have contact with nature? And that's a question right now. I think that's really on the forefront for all of us in our ways. And what comes to me is really what I feel is that to get as close as you can to the original source of things, to the raw nature of things. And for some of us, that means our backyards. That's why in this time, so many people have started gardening, which is amazing to me because it's that relationship. If you work in the garden, actually, you really are in a cyclical, reciprocal relationship. I mean, very much so. If you are living in an apartment, with every level of separation, it's a little harder. If you still have a balcony, it's one thing. If you don't, if you're living on the 50th floor somewhere in the middle of, a really busy, so it gets harder and harder, but it's never inaccessible. So I would say go to the closest route that you have to the original, to where things are unmitigated, because that's where the energy is easiest to feel and to connect with. And one thing when you said, how do I open the window for one, let the wind, let it actually notice that the wind is touching your face. Because there's still that, we can even take it all the way to trying to notice that the breath is still entering our nostrils, that we wouldn't be here without it. And that this breath is coming from the tree that I see outside the window. Try to make as much connection as possible. Get as close to the origins as possible. I also think studying the connection to the original of things can be really helpful at this time. And so with your body, certainly with your senses, like what we talked about, but also literally trying to understand how something works. So we can learning and relationship building with knowledge also can be really good. It's so amazing how many, how heartening it is for us to know, for example, that the way that the forest works is actually in co-participatory nature, and that there is one tree that is actually, when another tree isn't getting light, is filtering a certain amount of what it's receiving through the sunlight of its own photosynthesis, and it's giving that to the other tree who is in the sun less, which is really mind-boggling. And it's so healing for us because we think about competition and, the survival of the fittest, and we have all these things that are really old paradigm thinking. And to open our minds to new co-creational, flowing, naturally evolving, moving, co-participatory relationship, is vital for us. So all levels are good. So good books are good. It's not like, oh no, I can only do this with my body right now. Good food for the mind is good. And good food for the soul is important, whether it's a dream journal or, this is also a time where a lot of stuff is evoked. The threshold is so big and our habits are so interrupted that this is a time of opportunity as much as the suffering. It's also a time of insight. It's a time of quantum leaps, that can appear. I almost feel like it's a time where the cracks of the earth are open and there's all this energy emanating. Certainly, if you have any access to the raw natural world, use it, and that I would say is really, really big. But to say that all four shields are available always, the body and the psyche, the deep, deep, deep psyche, and the mind, the nature of mind is actually to relationship. That's the nature of mind. It's not necessarily about power. It's about relationship. To remember that. And the East, the power of the spirit and the unknown, the unbeknownst to us, the trust that whatever is here now wouldn't be here if it wasn't needed for what wants to be coming next. And that nothing is static, we don't stop here. And we are bound between the lineage that we come from, but the moving us forward isn't just by looking back. That's the thing. When people talk about remembering, they often think about going back to the old times or to the good times or to the I don't know what. But that's not an option, not as much as staying in the present is either. We are perpetually being moved and moving as we are being moved. And it's from the invitation of the future that we are getting pulled forward into all that is yet to be. That's where we incorporate whatever experiences, whether it's things that we regret we have done or things that we have learned or things that have changed for us. It's the invitation from the future that is coming of what is right action now. What is pulling us forward? What is ours to do? What is calling ourselves out? And that invitation right now is vibrant in the field and vital in the field. And I, like many others, my knees are shaking. There's a lot of invitation. I'm contemplating many things that are very, very risky right now because the invitation from the future is so big right now. And so I want to end with that because we've talked a lot about the hardship and the suffering this time, and it's really important to do that, and especially for all the people that are so much more vulnerable than us, marginalized community of all sorts and colors and races and all sorts of unproportionate, very, very unproportionate suffering that's endured right now. And to also not deny the invitation that is here to find our places of being in right relationship, moving into the invitation that's calling us from the future. What is the world, that we want to continue to live in and die into so that new can come? How are we giving ourselves to death in a way that can facilitate life, that can feed life? How are we willing to feed life in a way that new life can evolve from us and through us? How can we find a belonging that helps us to trust and give away?
They're the big, reflective questions and I'm reminded of Rilke's, sort of like sit with the questions, they're too big to be answered. That's the questions in themselves. That's a beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
And I would say it's never been about the answers. It's always about the questions.
Yeah, lovely. Oh, thank you so much, Petra. With that, I feel inspired. I've got goosebumps around that. That's really lovely. Okay, yeah.
Penelope, it was really beautiful to be with you. I want to thank you for inviting my voice here today. And my prayer is that in some way, shape, or form, it can serve whatever is next. And really, the great beauty that it's her who I serve. It's that, and I even that's just the name, but it's the unspeakable, but I have such gratitude for this life. Thank you so much for offering this conversation today.
Thank you so much. I feel very honoured. So we'll pause here and see you back for the next Earth Converse podcast, and let us know what you think and what you need, because we want this podcast to be helpful and meaningful for you. In the meantime, enjoy Earth, one conversation at a time.